Welcome to Eran Kaplan talking about male imagery in Israeli film in light of Karaoke, our opening night movie. Eran Kaplan is the Roder and Richard Goodman Chair for Israel Studies at San Francisco State University and the author of a great new book on Israeli cinema. Eran, take it away.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to speak to you. And I'm going to talk about masculinity on the Israeli screen. But I'd like to start by showing you cartoons that were drawn in Germany in the early part of the 20th century, anti-Semitic cartoons that will set our talk. So I'm going to share my screen with you and show you the following. So here are some classic anti-Semitic images that were drawn in the German press in the first part of the 20th century. And you can immediately recognize the Jew here on the left, eating and sucking everything away from the German people and the German government. But look at some of the physical characteristics that are attached to the Jew. Of course, we can always identify the Jewish nose in those caricatures, but also how unhealthy the Jew is portrayed in the anti-Semitic imagination. Here is another classic depiction of the Jew, of course, associated with money and wealth and taking it away from the righteous Gentiles. But look at the physical features of the Jew here on display, yet again, not only, again, the hooked nose, but how unhealthy he seems in this image. Here, the Jew is compared to rats and other dangerous animals, again, depriving the kind of the human healthy characteristics away, taking them away from the Jew. And here on the left, we have the healthy Aryan male, worker, engaged in physical activity, as opposed to the unhealthy Jewish banker on the right. Again, the anti-Semitic imagination. And here the very unhealthy Jew is taking away the young Gentile woman. Look at the bowed legs, and again, unhealthiness that he projects as opposed to the purity and health of the young non-Jewish woman. And look what happens here. The Jew stabbing the German soldier in the back on the front lines. But notice what happens to the Jewish male here. He also has feminine features. So the Jew has strength by virtue of the money and political power that he was able to assume. But the Jew himself, not only is he unhealthy, but he's not truly masculine. He's not truly a male. He is really effeminate. He is more like a woman. And in contrast to those anti-Semitic images, when the Zionist movement came onto the scene, they tried to project the very opposite image. They wanted to create the new Jew. And here we have a classic poster of the young Israeli Jewish soldier who's standing guard day and night. And look at the health, physicality that he projects. He is the new Jew, the new Hebrew, the antithesis of the diaspora Jew, a Jew who returns to the land to labor, to physicality, to strength, a Jew who's able to protect his country, protect his community, provide for his country and his community. And here are two young Israelis, again, soldiers projecting strength. So this is the imagery that the Zionist movement tried to create in its posters and stamps. But Israeli cinema really took on early on a similar mission. And in the early films produced in Palestine before the creation of the state and in Israel after the creation of the state, this imagery of the new Hebrew and of the new Jew was prevalent and dominant. And I'd like to give you two examples. The first is from the film He Walked the Field, Hu Halach Basadot. The film was produced in early 1967, but it's based on a novel that was published in 1948, and it tells the story of Uri. And Uri is the ideal Zionist. He's a member of a kibbutz, so he's a farmer, but he's also a member of the Haganah, the Jewish underground. So he is a fighter, and he combines both elements. I'll just show you a few seconds from that film. There's no subtitles. Don't worry about the dialogue. Just focus on the main character, Uri, played by Asi Dayan, the son of the famous Israeli general Moshe Dayan, and look how he is portrayed in this film. So I'm going to share my screen with you.
היי, חבר, פה זה לא מקלחת. אפילו לא שימי? זה בשבילך. מווילי. לי הוא יחסר, אפילו אם לך זה לא אכפת.
What is interesting about this film is that Asi Dayan has very little use for his shirt throughout this movie. So the healthy, strong, beautiful male body of the farmer and soldier is on full display in this film, really celebrating the new virility of Israeli maleness on the screen. I'd like to show you another example of those early representations of Israeli masculinity, again, a soldier, and this is taken from the movie Hill 24 Does Not Answer. This was an Israeli-British co-production from 1955, which was a heroic retelling of the 1948 war and Israel's struggle for independence. And it tells the story of four soldiers who end up dying on Hill 24, and by dying on the hill, Israel is able to claim sovereignty over that hill when the border between Israel and Jordan is drawn by UN mediators. But most of the movie are a series of flashbacks by which we learn how the various characters ended up on Hill 24. And one of those characters is a Sabra, a native-born Israeli, who joined the IDF in the war. And in that scene, he is fighting in the Negev desert against the Egyptian army. And there's a long battle scene. And at some point, our protagonist finds himself with a wounded enemy soldier. Again, he is fighting the Egyptians. He drags the wounded soldier into a cave in the desert in order for him to attend to him and help him. And let's look what happens when the young Sabra Israeli soldier is confronted with this enemy soldier in the cave.
טוב, נראה איך אפשר לסדר את זה, אה? אז איזה שפה אתה מדבר? מה, אתה אילם? תחכי ערבי. Sprichst du Deutsch? אל תגיד לי שאתה מדבר עברית, אה? You speak English? Okay. Easy, I know, that's all, see? Now, let's take off that shirt, huh? Oh, come on, let's take it off.
Nazi.
Nicht schießen! Don't talk German!
Nazi.
Yes, I was a Nazi, but I couldn't help it. Nobody could, no. Adolf Hitler. Did you ever see his eyes? That was a great power. We had to obey. He could do with us anything he wanted. We couldn't help ourselves. What would you do in my place, hey? What could you do? Yes, we did some terrible things against your people. I mean, those were our orders. Wanfan? I tell you why I'm here. Not because I want to fight the Jews. No. Just because I want to fight. Just fight. Anybody. Anything. I did not learn something else. We are born to fight, isn't that true? When there are no more wars, we'll have to invent them. Yeah? What you going to do with me? You're going to kill me? I'm a wounded prisoner. There's a law. Your army, what do they do with prisoners like me? You mustn't do what we did. We were wrong. It was against religion what we did. You are religious, yes? Yes, you must be. After all, this is the Holy Land. And you are the ones who gave us the Ten Commandments and Christianity. Christ was a Jew. And he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. You and I, we are soldiers. You must forgive me. It is your law, isn't it? Isn't it? Why don't you speak? Of what you accuse me? Who are you anyway? You lausiger Jude! You don't know who I am! Obersturmführer der Waffen-SS, Otto Ritterhoff! Jawohl, Otto Ritterhoff! Are you afraid? Ja, das war doch immer so. The dirty little gypsy mongrel is a coward. Okay, give me the gun. I do it for you. You have the word of a German officer. Go ahead. Give it me, please. All right. Then you do it. Go ahead. Go ahead, do it. Shoot, shoot, shoot. Obersturmführer der Waffen-SS, Otto Ritterhoff, zu Befehl! Soldaten, vorwärts! Wir sind die jungen Adler des neuen Deutschlands! Vorwärts! Deutschland ist die Welt! Heilig!
So this is a very surreal scene, though it could have happened. There were German veterans who fought as mercenaries in various Arab armies in the 1948 war. But for our purposes, this is a fascinating interaction between the Sabra, the new Jew, and an SS officer, the most extreme manifestation of anti-Semitic evil. But see again how the classic anti-Semitic position is reversed. Throughout the scene, it's the Nazi, the Aryan, who's on the ground, and it is the Jew, the new Jew, who stands proudly above him. Also, except for the very start of the scene, the Israeli soldier is silent. It's the Nazi who's trying to talk himself out of trouble, to manipulate himself out of trouble. Again, playing on classic anti-Semitic tropes and reversing them. Now, for a fleeting moment there, in his delusions, for a second, the SS officer sees the Jew as the victim, as the diaspora Jew, in classic Jewish garb, of course, with the yellow star. But this immediately evaporates, and we are confronted by the strong, assured Israeli soldier, the new Jew, overcoming both external enemies, but also a legacy of passivity and Jewish weakness in creating these new tropes of masculinity. So these images, these ideals really dominated Zionist and Israeli culture going back to the 1920s and all the way up to the 1960s in Israel, kind of a heroic celebration of the rebirth of the nation and really the creation of a new culture and a new society that's based on health, youth, vitality, strength. Those were the virtues associated with this new society. However, by the 1960s, we begin to see that in Israeli cinema, the traditional representations of masculinity begin to fade away, and a new, more critical gaze is put upon the question of masculinity and its significance in Israeli society. And one way that this has happened is by adopting a generally critical look at the impact of the military service, wars, and loss on Israeli society and culture. I'd like now to show you a clip from the Israeli film Siege from 1969. This is a film that tells the story of a war widow, lost her husband in the 1967 war. And really the majority of the film describes her attempts to recover from the loss of the death of her husband and reinsert herself back into mainstream society. But throughout the film, she's still surrounded by the memory of her husband, his army comrades who still provide her with social and emotional support. And in the scene that we will see now, the young woman and her son, followed by some of her husband's military friends, they go to visit another of their friends who lost a leg in the 1967 war, and he's in an army medical facility. So let's see the scene that describes this visit.
אתה לא מרים אותה וזה יותר מדי גדול. כך, עכשיו, קדימה. לא, הידיים נשארת במקום. קדימה. יותר מדי גדול. ככה, עכשיו. ידיים, קדימה. שמאל. די, תראי. תסתכל. קדימה. הלאה. לא, זה יותר מדי? זהו, ככה. קדימה. שמאל. בסדר, בדיוק בקו של הידיים. בסדר גמור, רק תשחרר את הכתפיים. כן.
כל הכבוד.
עשו עבודה נקייה. חבל שהרגל לא מעץ.
אתה רוצה לראות כמו שודד ים?
הגרב נופלת לי כל הזמן. אילו הייתה לי רגל מעץ, הייתי מחזק אותה עם בני עצים.
אתה לא נורמלי. יש לנו מתנה בשבילך.
So at the heart of the scene are the classic Israeli soldiers. They were strong, they were healthy, they were willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. But what we ultimately see is their broken bodies on display. So what was once healthy is now broken, now destroyed. And while there is some humor associated with this scene, still it's a very devastating gaze on the impact of war and its impact on the body, and especially here on the male body. So this is no longer a celebration, but a much more critical look at the impact of the ideology that created the ideal image of the male and what it creates in society. And there are several Israeli films that have described and dealt with the image and the impact of war on the young Israelis. And one can think of movies like Paratroopers and Doesn't Give a Damn and many others. And even going all the way to the 21st century, we can think of, for example, the Lebanon trilogy, three very famous and successful Israeli films that were produced in 2007, 8, and 9. I'm talking about before, also with Bashir and Lebanon, that deal with the Israeli military experience in Lebanon, but especially the impact on young men. And those movies explore in great detail the psychological trauma that those young men are carrying with them and how they create a much more feeble and unstable characters, very different from the very resolute characters that we saw in the examples from early Israeli cinema. What I'd like to show you now is a scene from one of those films, from the movie Before, that was directed by Joseph Cedar in 2007, nominated for an Academy Award. And it is tells the story of the last days of the Israeli military in southern Lebanon, in the security zone that Israel established in southern Lebanon after the Israeli invasion of 1982, and from which Israel withdrew ultimately in May of 2000. And in the security zone, Israel built several outposts that were manned by Israeli soldiers. And by the late 1990s, leading into 2000, they were under constant attacks by Hezbollah forces inside of Lebanon. And those soldiers really turned into sitting ducks. They were not allowed to operate militarily in Lebanon. All they had to do was hold on to those military outposts for reasons that growing segments of the Israeli population could no longer understand or justify. And the Before was one of those military outposts in southern Lebanon. And the movie really chronicles the last few weeks in the lives of the soldiers stationed there. These are all combat soldiers, healthy, strong, but they are under a barrage of Hezbollah rocket attacks. And let's see one of those scenes, and we'll see what happens to the very brave, courageous commander, young commander of this military outpost, who in many ways is a symbol of a typical Israeli soldier, but in light of the constant pressures, violence, and growing fear, he behaves in the following manner in the scene that we will now.
קיסר מקודקוד ברדלס. קיסר מקודקוד ברדלס, קבל, יש לי כאן פרח רציני, אני צריך דרדר במיידי. האם קיבלת? עבור. קאווי, אתה שומע אותי? בסדר? מה תמונת מצב? עכשיו אמרתי לך, דרדר, תביא דרדר, אל תגידי לי רגע. בוא נעלה אותו לאלונקה, חייבים להוריד אותו. תרים את הראש. תרים אותו. תשיגו את התחת על האלונקה. די, תן כוח. כוח בראש, ביד. סלאוי, אתה שומע אותי? סלאוי. תהיה חזק. חזק, ילד, אני אוהב אותך. תרים. אין פה, אני מחליף אותך, אני פה בעמדה עד שצוות כהנות מגיע. טוב, תשאר כאן. תפתח עיניים, יכול להיות פה תקיפה משולמת. רק בהם, כל סאמו! בטח מחכים שהנפילות ייגמרו. סע כבר עם צ'יקלאוי, סע! אני עף, אני חוזר עוד מעט, תפתח עיניים, אושרי! תוסו למעלה, מה אתם עושים פה? תוסו סופים! כרמל ב', תעלו למנחת, כרמל א', תן לי תמונת מצב. מה עם הדרדר, קיסר? מה את הדוקטור, מתי אפשר לפנות אותו?
יש מסוק, ברגע שהגיע, אני מוכן.
הוא יהיה בסדר?
לא יודע, לירז, לא יודע.
פנימה, לירה! תכניס לי פנימה!
אושרי.
לירה!
In many ways, as we are introduced to Liraz, the commander of this outpost at the beginning of the film, he is a typical Israeli soldier who could have easily fit into Israeli films of the 1950s and 1960s. Strong, resolute, competent, confident. He is a new Jew, a new Hebrew in this regard. But in the reality of the before, he comes apart. And as we can see in this scene, he loses his courage, he loses his ability to lead, he loses his confidence, and he's really broken up. So in many ways, the traditional, classic, Sabra, New Hebrew comes apart before our very eyes, and it'll be very difficult to find today on the Israeli screen the type of representations of masculinity that was so prevalent early on in Israeli cinema. But I want to stay here in the military and show you yet another fascinating description of Israeli masculinity on the Israeli screen that has to do with military service. And the film that I'm alluding to is Yossi and Jagger, which was produced in 2002. The director is Eitan Fox, and very much like before, tells the story of young Israeli combat soldiers, in this case, members of the Golani Brigade, who serve on the Israeli-Lebanese border on the slopes of Mount Hermon. So the setting is very similar to before in many other Israeli films. And let's see the opening scene from that film.
יאללה, תעיף את הסרחון הזה פנימה. תראה בו שנייה.
בסדר, תוריד לחץ.
ליאור ואני צריכים לצאת לאיזה שעה.
לאן?
בקשר למודל מחר בלילה, אנחנו צריכים לבדוק את השטח.
לא עשיתם את זה לפני שבוע?
כן, אבל משהו לא מסתדר לי שם בכיוונים של העמדות.
אז אולי אני אצא איתך, אני אשמח להתעבר מאחור הזה לאיזה שעה. לג'אגר לא אכפת. ג'אגר.
מבחינתי זה בסדר. תשמע, ליאור כבר מכיר את השטח, זה יקצר את הזמן. כשאנחנו קצת הם תפוחים, וככה אני רוצה לראות אותם עובדים על הציודים כל היום. אנחנו נחזור עוד שעה בערך. פעם הבאה, מה אתה כזה מבואס? יאללה, ליאור, בוא נזוז.
תגיד לי, מה אני נראה לך, משוויץ? כן רגע.
אין זמן.
נודניק.
מה אמרת?
נודניק!
יוסי!
זה אונס המפקד.
זה לא נורמלי, ליאור, אני זורק חיילים לכלא על דבר כזה.
תתרכז בבקשה.
לא מאמין.
מה לעשות? אני פרוע.
So Yossi and Jagger are Golani officers, and they look the part. Again, typical Israeli masculinity of young soldiers. But of course, in this film, they upend everything by presenting Yossi and Jagger not only as officers, but also as gay lovers in the IDF. And so certain preconceived notions that we might have about masculinity and its representation are upended in this film and are presented to us in a new way. There's another interesting thing about this film is that, of course, we saw Yossi and Jagger kiss. I've seen many Israeli movies, I would say almost hundreds. And whereas in American cinema, the romantic kiss is an integral part of the American film canon, in Israeli cinema, in fact, there are very few romantic kisses, very few. And this also has to do, I think, with representations of masculinity. The attempt to project certain resolve, strength, seriousness kept romance away from the Israeli screen. It seemed as if romance would undermine, weaken, diminish the image of the new Israeli subject, of the Sabra. But of course, in this case, weakness is actually part of the image, is part of the representation. And here, this kiss, which is the first indication that the movie gives us of the relationship between those two male officers, already opens up a whole new atmosphere, a whole new arena in which the characters operate in. And so the traditional Israeli masculinity is reduced to the background, and a new form of masculinity that draws from the past, but in a way undermines it and changes, emerges before our very eyes. So here we have soldiers, but they're somewhat different from the soldiers that we tended to encounter in the past. And in fact, there are a variety of new forms of masculinity that are appearing before us on the Israeli screen. It's not only soldiers or young people, but a variety of characters that present us with new images of maleness in cinema. For example, the ethnic divide that has defined Israeli society from the very beginning, the differences between Ashkenazim and Mizrahi Jews, between Jews of European descent and Jews who came from Arab and Middle Eastern countries. Early Zionist society was comprised mainly of Jews who came primarily from Eastern Europe. And Zionist culture was very much an Ashkenazi culture. And so the characters that we saw on screen were predominantly Ashkenazi. But starting in the 1960s, with the ethnic comedies that pitted Ashkenazi against Mizrahi Jews, the balance began to shift. But in recent years, the majority of the male and all characters on Israeli screen are not necessarily Ashkenazi characters. Many of them are of Middle Eastern descent, or in some cases, it's hard to tell what their ethnic background is. So this is another interesting development that we see unfolding before our very eyes in Israeli cinema. And in a movie like Karaoke, again, it's on display, takes place in Holon, a suburb south of Tel Aviv, that historically was home to immigrants who came from Middle Eastern countries in the 1950s and 1960s. And we can only assume, though a couple of times it's mentioned, that the characters are of Middle Eastern background, and it is part of the story. Another development that has happened in recent years in Israeli cinema is the emergence of religious characters who grow to dominate the Israeli screen. Zionist culture at the very beginning was very much a secular culture. And I tried to present it to you early on when I spoke about early Zionist culture, that it was in many ways a revolt against the Jewish culture of the diaspora and the legacies of centuries of traditional Jewish ways of life. And the secular nature of the characters was on full display. In fact, religious characters were hardly to be seen on the Israeli screen. However, just as Israeli society and culture are changing, and religious Jews taking a more prominent role in all aspects of Israeli life in recent years, we see more and more religious, ultra-Orthodox, modern Orthodox, traditional Jews who come onto the screen, again, undermining the traditional image of the secular Jewish character. One other change is that early Israeli cinema, very much like early Zionist culture and Israeli culture, celebrated youth. It was the culture and society of young people. The main protagonists were farmers, laborers, soldiers. These are all young people. Also, Zionist society was comprised largely of young people. The chalutzim, the pioneers, the immigrants tended to be young people, and they built the culture and they documented the culture, so they figure prominently in it. And on the Israeli screen, you'd be hard-pressed to find people who are middle-aged, let alone old. It almost did not exist in the annals of Israeli cinema. But Israel is still young, but not that young. Israel itself is becoming older, and it has a historical perspective. It has a sense of time, but it also has more and more old people. Also, medicine is very good in Israel, so people can live a very long life. And because Israeli cinema ultimately documents and tells us about the Israeli experience, we end up seeing more and more older characters in Israeli films of recent vintage. So we're not only going to encounter 18-year-olds who are serving in the military, we will also encounter people who are about to retire from work, people who live in retirement communities. This is a very fluid culture in this regard, and it is evident to us on the screen. And again, here, karaoke is very indicative of those changes that are happening in Israeli cinema and the ways by which masculinity is described. There are very few young people on the screen. The main characters are either in their midlife or later on, and they are dealing with the struggles and issues and questions that people at that phase of their life are confronted with. And here, questions of masculinity, maybe sexual identity, and the relationship between those issues really come to the fore and play before our very eyes. So if Israeli cinema early on offer us a very definite, maybe simplistic view of what it means to be masculine, male on the screen, as time goes by and as Israeli culture becomes more multifaceted and more complex, so are the images and representations of masculinity. Thank you very much.
Again, excellent talk. And I'm going to go out and buy your book about projecting Israel on the screen. Thank you so much, Professor Kaplan. And maybe one day we'll see you in person at the movies.
I look forward.
Toda.